Ranger Sarah Voss had a rule about the fog, and the rule was simple: respect it or we'll take something from you. She had learned this rule the hard way, 3 years in her job at Ashford Hollow National Forest, when a sudden whiteout had nearly cost her a hiker she was escorting down from the overlooked trail. The fog in this particular stretch of Appalachian forest didn't behave like fog anywhere else she had worked. It came up out of the hollows at strange hours, moved against the wind, and swallowed sound in a way that made the world feel padded and distant, like listening through a wall. The old-timers in town called it the breath of the mountain. Sarah called it a hazard and treated it accordingly. Tonight, the sky was clear, stars in their thousands, the Milky Way smeared bright across a moonless dark, the kind of night that made the job worth the low pay and the isolation. She drove the access road with her window cracked, letting the cool October air move through the truck cab, listening to the radio chatter from the two other rangers on duty. "Voss, you copy." That was Daniel Reyes, 26, 2 years on the job, still young enough to find the night shift romantic instead of merely cold. "Copy," she said. "Status. Quiet. Real quiet. I did a loop past Cold Spring and didn't see a soul." "You?" "Same. Heading up toward the fire road now." "Lucky you. I got the noisy half of the woods. Coyotes are going off somewhere past Birch Run." She smiled despite herself. Daniel always made the job sound like a podcast he was narrating live. She liked working with him. He was careless about some things, paperwork, mostly, but careful about the things that mattered, like checking his footing on wet rock and never assuming a downed hiker was just resting. The third voice on the radio belonged to Marisol Ortiz, the senior ranger on shift, a woman in her 50s with 30 years in the Forest Service and the kind of dry humor that made briefings bearable. "You two keep the channel for emergencies," she said. "Not for your nature podcast." "Copy that, boss," Daniel said, and Sarah heard the grin in his voice even through the static. Sarah drove on. The fire road climbed gradually through stands of oak and hickory, the headlights catching the eyes of something small and quick in the underbrush. A possum, maybe, or a fox, before it vanished into the dark. She had 4 hours left on shift. She intended to spend them quietly, the way she liked her shifts to go, checking trailheads and campsites, and watching the sky for the kind of trouble that didn't usually announce itself with warning signs. She didn't know yet that something else was watching the sky too, and that it had already chosen its hunting ground for the night, and that the hunting ground was the exact stretch a fire road her truck was currently climbing. She found out about an hour later, when the fog came up out of Cold Hollow without warning, on a night with no moon and no wind to explain it, and swallowed the road in front of her so completely that she had to stop the truck and idle there, waiting, while the world disappeared one tree at a time. The fog had a smell to it that Sarah had never been able to describe to anyone outside the park. Not quite the clean mineral smell of normal mountain mist, but something underneath that, faintly sweet and faintly wrong, like flowers left too long in a vase. She noticed it now, rolling in through her cracked window, and she rolled the window up out of habit before she had consciously decided to. She radioed it in. "Dispatch, Voss. Fog's come up on the fire road. Visibility's dropping fast. Going to hold position until it clears or thins enough to navigate." "Copy, Voss," said the dispatcher, a calm-voweled man named Pruitt who'd worked the overnight desk for longer than Sarah had been alive. Reyes reported the same about 4 minutes ago, over near Birch Run. "Ortiz is still showing clear near the ranger station." "It's localized then." "Looks that way. You good to sit tight?" "I'm good." She idled the truck and watched the headlights illuminate a wall of gray that seemed, if anything, to be getting denser rather than thinner. The trees at the edge of the beam had gone soft-edged, like a photograph slightly out of focus, and beyond perhaps 30 feet there was nothing at all, just an absence, a held breath of white. Something about the absence made her uneasy in a way she couldn't immediately justify. She had sat through fog before. She had sat through worse fog than this. Technically, the whiteout 3 years ago had been so total she couldn't see her own boots. But there was a quality to tonight's fog that felt less like weather and more like a held door, like something had been let into the woods through a gap, and the gap had not yet closed. She was a practical woman, and she filed the feeling under nerves and let it go. 20 minutes passed. The radio stayed quiet except for routine check-ins. Sarah ate half a granola bar from the glove box and thought about her sister's wedding in November, about whether she'd requested the right weekend off, about nothing in particular, the way the mind drifts during long waits. Then Daniel's voice came through the radio, and it had lost its podcast narrator warmth entirely. "Dispatch, this is Reyes. I need a pause, static, the particular hiss of a radio held too close to a mouth that was breathing too hard. I need someone out at Birch Run. Now. There's something out here." Pruitt's voice, carefully even. "Reyes, say again, what's your situation?" "I don't." Another pause. Sarah heard something in the background of the transmission, something that might have been wind through branches, except the night was dead still. It might have been an animal, except no animal she'd ever heard made a sound shaped quite like that. "I think something's tracking me. Through the fog. I can hear it, but I can't." The transmission cut to static. Sarah was already moving, the truck in gear before she'd fully decided to drive. The fog be damned. "Reyes, this is Voss. I'm en route. Hold your position if you can." She pulled the truck into a slow crawl forward into the white wall, headlights doing almost nothing against the density of it. Every instinct in her body screaming that this was the wrong direction to drive a vehicle she could not see 10 feet in front of, and every other instinct screaming louder that Daniel needed help, and she was the closest ranger on the mountain. The drive to Birch Run took 11 minutes that felt like an hour. Sarah kept the truck at a crawl, leaning forward over the wheel, watching for the reflective trail markers that lined the fire road every quarter mile. The fog thinned and thickened in patches, never fully clearing, and twice she had to stop entirely when the white became so total that the headlights simply vanished into it without illuminating anything at all. Pruitt stayed on the radio the whole time, his voice a steady tether. "Ortiz is en route from the station. ETA 15 minutes. I've got the county on standby if we need a wider response." "Copy," Sarah said. "Still no contact from Reyes?" "Negative since the last transmission." She didn't let herself think too hard about what that meant. She kept driving. She found his truck first, pulled half onto the shoulder near the Birch Run trailhead, driver's door hanging open, headlights still on, and burning 2 soft cones of white into the fog. The engine was off. The keys, she would learn later, were still in the ignition. She parked behind it and got out with her flashlight and her hand resting near her sidearm, a precaution she'd never had cause to take seriously before tonight. "Daniel." Her voice sounded strange in the fog-muffled dark, flattened and close, like calling out in a small room rather than an open forest. "Daniel, it's Sarah." No answer. She swept the flashlight beam across the gravel shoulder and found his radio first, lying in the dirt a few feet from the open truck door, the antenna bent at an angle that suggested it had been dropped rather than set down. Beside it, a scuff mark in the gravel, a long drag mark like something heavy had been pulled, or something had braced its heels and fought against being pulled. She followed the drag mark to the tree line. The trail of disturbance continued into the underbrush. Broken ferns, a snapped branch at chest height, the kind of damage a body makes moving fast and without care for its own safety. She followed it with her flashlight up and her other hand on her weapon, every sense straining against the fog's strange muffling effect, and she became aware, gradually and then all at once, that she could hear breathing that was not her own. Slow, deep, coming from somewhere ahead and slightly above, as though whatever was breathing stood taller than any person had a right to stand. She stopped walking. The fog ahead of her thickened into a shape, not the formless drift of mist, but something with edges, something crouched among the ferns 20 feet ahead with its head low and its shoulders impossibly wide. She raised the flashlight beam toward it, and the light caught 2 points of reflected shine where eyes should be, low to the ground, watching her with a patience that made her skin go cold beneath her uniform jacket. Then it moved, and the fog moved with it, and Sarah understood in the marrow of her bones that she had just become the second ranger this thing intended to hunt tonight. She didn't run immediately. 6 years of training held her in place for one critical, terrible second. The part of her that had been taught to assess before reacting, to gather information, to think clearly under pressure. In that second, the shape resolved further out of the fog, and what she saw made the training fail her completely. It moved on four limbs, but its proportions were wrong for any four-legged animal she knew. The forelimbs too long, ending in something that flexed like fingers even as it bore weight like paws. Its head was lowered, muzzle dark and wet-looking even through the fog, but when it lifted the head to look at her directly, the angle of the skull was wrong in a way her mind kept trying and failing to correct into something familiar. Not quite wolf. Not quite anything. It made a sound low in its chest. Not a growl exactly. More like a word forming in a throat that had not been built for words. Sarah ran. She didn't look back to see if it followed. She didn't need to. She heard it. Heard the controlled, unhurried cadence of something pacing itself to her speed rather than straining to catch her. Heard branches give way to something far larger than the fog had let her properly judge. Heard that same low not quite growl rolling out behind her like a held note. She hit the radio button on her shoulder mic without slowing. Pruitt! Pruitt! I have eyes on whatever got Reyes. I am being pursued. I need... A root caught her boot and she stumbled, caught herself against a tree trunk, kept moving. I need backup at Birch Run immediately. I am off the fire road in the tree line, heading... She had no idea which direction she was heading. The fog had erased every landmark. I don't know which direction. I'm running. Pruitt's voice, tight now, finally cracking its careful calm. Ortiz is 3 minutes out. Sarah, can you get back to your vehicle? She didn't answer. She couldn't spare the breath. Behind her, the pacing had stopped being patient. She heard the gate change, heard the controlled trot become something faster, something that closed distance with an ease that made her stomach drop through the forest floor. She broke from the tree line into a small clearing she didn't recognize, fog pooling waist deep across the open ground like something liquid, and she had perhaps half a second to register the unfamiliar terrain before the thing hit the clearing's edge behind her at a dead run. She turned, because some animal instinct in her understood that running blind in unfamiliar ground was worse than facing what was coming, and she drew her sidearm with hands that were shaking and raised it toward the shape closing the last 20 feet between them. She fired 3 times. The shots did something. She saw the creature's stride break, saw it twist sideways with a sound that was almost human in its outrage, a snarled half-shout of pain that cut through the fog-muffled night with terrible clarity. But it didn't go down, and it didn't stop. It hit her a half-second later with the force of a vehicle, and the impact took the gun from her hand and the breath from her lungs and put her on her back in the wet grass with the fog closing overhead like a lid. She remembered very little of the next several seconds with any clarity. She remembered the weight of it on top of her, suffocating and immense. She remembered the smell, that same sweet wrong smell from the fog itself, but stronger now, mixed with something hot and metallic that she understood, distantly, was her own blood. She remembered pain across her shoulder and forearm, sharp and then strangely distant, the way pain goes when a body decides it has more urgent business than reporting damage. She remembered, more than anything, the eyes. They were close to hers when the weight shifted, when the creature paused, for just a moment, for one held breath, to look at her directly, and in that moment she saw something in those eyes that she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget and never quite managing. Not animal hunger, though that was there too. Something underneath the hunger. Something that looked impossibly aware, watching her from behind a face that had stopped being capable of human expression a long time ago. Then headlights cut through the clearing's fog, and a voice, Marisol Ortiz's voice, raised and furious and afraid in exactly the right proportions, shouted something Sarah's ringing ears couldn't parse, and the weight came off her all at once. She heard 2 shots, close together, fired from a position several yards to her left. She heard the creature's roar, full-throated now, no longer disguising itself as anything animal ordinary, and heard it retreat, fast, crashing back through the underbrush in the direction it had come, leaving a trail of broken branches and a low, keening sound that faded into the general muffled hush of the fog. Ortiz was beside her almost immediately, flashlight in one hand, sidearm still raised in the other, sweeping the tree line for any sign of return. Sarah, look at me. Stay with me. Daniel, Sarah managed. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Where's Daniel? Ortiz's face, in the wash of the flashlight beam, told her before the older woman said a word. Sarah felt the answer land in her chest like a second wound, sharper in its way than the gashes across her shoulder. She understood that whatever had been pacing her through the fog had already taken Daniel Reyes from them, and that it had only retreated, not given up, and would not stop simply because two of its three targets were still breathing. She made herself sit up, made herself reach for the radio, still clipped to her ruined jacket. Whatever was out there in the fog wanted her afraid and still. She intended to be neither for 1 second longer than her body forced on her. "Pruitt," she said, voice rough but steady now. "We need a team out here at first light to recover Daniel. And until then, nobody else comes up this mountain alone." "Copy that," Pruitt said, and for the first time all night, his careful calm cracked just slightly with relief at hearing her voice form full sentences. "Ambulance is 6 minutes out. Hang on, Sarah." She intended to. She had no plans to do anything else. Sarah spent 4 days in a hospital bed in the small regional medical center 40 minutes off the mountain, and she spent most of those 4 days angry rather than afraid, which surprised the nurses and didn't surprise her at all. The wounds across her shoulder and forearm had required 31 stitches and a course of antibiotics strong enough to make her stomach turn. But the doctor, a calm, unhurried man named Okafor who had clearly decided not to ask too many questions about the official incident report's vague language regarding large animal encounter, told her she'd healed clean and would keep full use of the arm. Ortiz visited on the second day, sitting in the stiff vinyl chair beside the bed with the particular posture of a woman who had delivered bad news to families more times than she could count and had never gotten used to it. They found him, Ortiz said, without preamble, because Sarah had told her on the first visit not to soften things. "Search team this morning. About 200 yards past where you went down." Sarah nodded slowly. She had known, on some level, since the clearing. Knowing didn't make hearing it any easier. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm not going to describe it to you, and you're not going to ask the coroner to either." Ortiz's voice was steady, but her hands, folded in her lap, were not quite still. "His mother's flying in from Phoenix tomorrow." Sarah looked at the ceiling tile above her bed for a long moment. "I want to know what we're dealing with, Marisol. Not folklore, not theories. I want to know what actually attacked us, because whatever paperwork goes into that official report, you and I both know it wasn't a bear and it wasn't a mountain lion." Ortiz was quiet for long enough that Sarah turned her head to look at her directly. "There's a man," Ortiz finally said. "Used to be Forest Service, retired now, lives about an hour past the park boundary. Name's Hollis Granger. He worked Ashford Hollow for almost 40 years before I ever set foot here, and there were always stories about him, that he knew the mountain better than the maps did, that he'd seen things in his early years he stopped reporting because nobody believed him and it started costing him his credibility." She exhaled slowly. "I called him yesterday, told him what happened to Daniel, told him what you described." "What did he say?" "He said he'd be expecting my call eventually. He's been expecting it for 30 years. Ortiz met her eyes. "He said it's happened before. Not often. Maybe once a generation. And he said the only people who've ever survived it did one specific thing differently than everyone who didn't." "What's that?" "They stopped running from it and started hunting it back." Sarah checked herself out of the hospital against Dr. Okafor's mild but persistent objection on the morning of the 5th day, arm in a supportive sling, and had Ortiz drive her the hour past the park boundary to a cabin set back from a gravel county road, half hidden behind a stand of black walnut trees that had dropped their leaves early this year. Hollis Granger was somewhere in his late 70s, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd spent a working lifetime outdoors, with a white beard kept close and a gaze that settled on Sarah's bandaged arm before it settled on her face. "You're the one it marked," he said, by way of greeting, and ushered them both inside without further preamble. The cabin's main room functioned as much like an archive as a living space. Shelves of journals, hand-drawn maps of the Ashford Hollow region marked with small red symbols, whose meaning Sarah didn't yet understand, a few mounted animal skulls that she suspected were not entirely for decoration. Hollis poured them all coffee without asking and sat across a scarred wooden table, studying Sarah with an intensity that made her sit a little straighter. "Tell me what you saw," he said. "Everything. Don't worry about whether it sounds insane. I promise you it won't. Not to me." She told him. The fog that came up wrong, against the wind, on a night with no moon to explain it. The shape that resolved out of it, wrong-jointed, too large, with a head that her mind kept failing to properly categorize. The eyes, when it had paused over her, aware in a way that had unsettled her more than the teeth had. Hollis listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at the description of the eyes. "It's still got something of the man left in it, then," he said, when she finished. "That's both better and worse news than you'd think." "Man?" Ortiz asked. "There's always a man first," Hollis said. "Or a woman, time to time, though it's rarer. Somebody who came up this mountain 40, 50 years back and ran afoul of something that was already old when this forest was young. Whatever you're calling it in your reports, bear, lion, whatever makes the paperwork easier, the truth is simpler and worse. It's called a few things by the people who've studied it the longest. I favor the old Cherokee term, though I won't claim to pronounce it the way it ought to be pronounced. Loosely, it means the hollow one, the one who hunts wearing what it killed." Sarah set her coffee down carefully. "You're telling me this is the same creature for 50 years. I'm telling you it doesn't die easy, and it doesn't die alone," Hollis said. "And I'm telling you that if you mean to stop it before it finishes what it started with your friend Reyes, you're going to need to know exactly what kills it, because guessing wrong will get you killed the way it nearly did 5 nights ago." Hollis Granger had spent the better part of 4 decades compiling what he called, without irony, the File, a collection of incident reports, old newspaper clippings, interviews with retired rangers and longtime locals, and his own field notes from a handful of encounters he'd had himself in his 30s, encounters that had ended his marriage and very nearly his career when he'd refused to stop talking about them. He laid it all out across the table for Sarah and Ortiz, with the patient thoroughness of a man who had been waiting decades for someone to finally need this information. "It comes in cycles," he said. "Long, quiet stretches, sometimes 15, 20 years, and then a season where it wakes up and starts hunting again. Always starts with the fog. That's not coincidental. By the way, the fog is the thing's doing, not just whether it happens to enjoy. Some kind of camouflage, or maybe something closer to a calling card. Old folks used to say the mountain itself breathed it out to warn people off, but I've come around to thinking it's closer to the opposite. I think the thing makes its own weather to hunt in." "How do you kill it?" Sarah asked. Hollis was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table. "There's a story, and I want to be honest, it's the thinnest part of the file, mostly secondhand, mostly old. That silver matters. Not in the cartoonish sense people think of from the films. But there's enough consistency across 3 separate accounts, 40 years apart, that I don't dismiss it. One account says a hunter back in the 50s carried a silver pocket watch into the woods, and the thing wouldn't come within 20 feet of him the whole night, though it took 2 other men that same season." "That's thin," Ortiz said. "I told you it was thin," Hollis agreed. "Here's what isn't thin. 3 accounts, all independent, all describing the same vulnerable window. Right after it feeds for somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour, it's slower, heavier. Whatever change it goes through to hunt seems to cost it something physically, and it needs time to recover that cost after a kill. That's the window where 2 of my 3 survivor accounts managed to do real damage to it. Gunshots that actually staggered it, instead of just slowing it down for a few seconds the way you described from your own encounter." Sarah thought about the 3 rounds she'd put into it in the clearing, about the way it had twisted and snarled but kept coming, fast and strong, not staggered the way a wounded animal staggers. "It hadn't fed yet when I shot it," she said slowly. "No," Hollis agreed. "It had already gotten your partner by the time you found his truck, which means, by my count, it should have been in its slow window when it came for you instead of fast." The 3 of them sat with that for a long moment. "Unless it wasn't finished," Ortiz said quietly. "Unless killing Daniel didn't count as feeding." Hollis nodded slowly, his expression grim, which would mean it's still hungry, and it's going to come back up that mountain, looking to finish the job. They spent the next 2 days preparing in the methodical, unglamorous way that real threats actually got addressed. Not with dramatic speeches, but with phone calls, supply runs, and careful planning across Hollis's kitchen table. Ortiz pulled the park's silver collection from an unlikely source, a retired ranger named Pete Suarez who'd taken up jewelry making after his knee gave out, and who, once Ortiz explained the situation with the careful vagueness of someone who decided some truths were better delivered face to face, produced a box of silver-plated rifle rounds he'd cast as a novelty project years ago and never quite gotten around to selling. Hollis examined them with the focus of a man checking a parachute and declared them sufficient, if not perfect. Sarah, against Dr. Okafor's continued objections relayed secondhand through Ortiz, insisted on being part of whatever came next. Her arm was healing. Her resolve, if anything, had hardened in the days since the clearing. She had not stopped seeing those eyes when she closed her own at night, and she had decided, somewhere in the second sleepless hospital night, that the only way to stop seeing them was to be the one who put an end to whatever was behind them. "You don't owe this mountain your life," Hollis told her bluntly, on the second evening, watching her load silver rounds into a rifle magazine with hands that had mostly stopped shaking. "I don't owe it anything," Sarah agreed. "But Daniel did his job up there for 2 years, and it ended with his mother flying in from Phoenix to identify what was left of him. I'm not interested in being the next name on your file, Hollis. I'm interested in making sure there isn't a next name at all." Hollis studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man recognizing something in another person that he recognized in himself. "Then we do this carefully," he said. "Not heroics. Not running in blind. We use what the file taught us, and we use the one advantage you have that none of my old accounts had." "What's that?" "You've seen it up close and lived. That's rarer than you'd think." The plan, when Hollis finally laid it out in full across the kitchen table with a hand-drawn map of the Ashford Hollow Fire roads weighted down at the corners by coffee mugs, was deceptively simple in its structure and demanding in its execution. They would not hunt the creature across the whole mountain. An impossible task, given its terrain advantage and the disorienting fog it seemed to summon at will. Instead, they would use what Hollis's decades of file-keeping suggested was a consistent pattern. The creature returned, again and again across its documented cycles, to the same general hunting ground near Birch Run and Cold Hollow, the same stretch of forest where it had first taken Daniel and nearly taken Sarah. "Predictable territory," Hollis said. "Most predators have it, even the unnatural ones. It knows that ground, knows the deer trails, the deadfalls, the places fog pools naturally even without its help. We don't chase it across 40,000 acres. We let it come to ground it already favors, and we make sure that when it does, we're not the ones caught unprepared this time." Ortiz traced a finger along the map. "We set up here then. The clearing where it took Sarah down. High ground on 2 sides, that rock outcrop for cover, clear sight lines if the fog cooperates even a little." "And if the fog doesn't cooperate?" Sarah asked. "Then we use this," Hollis said, and produced from a worn canvas bag 3 handheld spotlights. Modified, he explained, with a particular filter he'd experimented with years ago after one of his own encounters. UV leaning bulbs that cut through dense fog noticeably better than standard beams, a trick he'd half remembered from an old mountaineering manual and half stumbled into through years of trial and error. Sarah turned one of the silver rounds over in her fingers, feeling its unfamiliar weight, thinking about the window Hollis had described, the 20 to 60 minutes after a feeding when the creature ran slower, heavier, more vulnerable than its usual terrifying speed. "We need to make sure it hasn't fed before we engage," she said. "If it's already eaten something else between now and when we go up there, we lose our advantage." "Agreed," Ortiz said. "Which means nobody else goes up that mountain alone until this is finished. No civilians, no solo patrols, nothing that gives an easy meal before we're ready for it." Hollis looked between the 2 women, one battle-tested by decades in these woods, one freshly marked by the thing they intended to hunt, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the cautious, unfamiliar shape of hope. "Then we go up tomorrow night," he said, "before the moon waxes any further, and we finish what should have been finished 40 years ago." Sarah didn't sleep much the night before they went up the mountain, but the sleeplessness had a different texture to it than the hospital nights had. Less dread, more the restless, focused energy of someone running through a plan in her head, looking for the gaps. She sat on the porch of Ortiz's small house just outside the park boundary, cleaning a rifle she'd already cleaned twice, while Ortiz moved around the kitchen behind her doing the same restless work with maps and ammunition counts. "You don't have to be the one in the clearing," Ortiz said, coming out with 2 mugs of coffee neither of them particularly wanted, but both needed something to hold. "Hollis and I can take point. You've already given this thing a piece of you. Nobody would think less of you for sitting this one out." Sarah took the mug, turned it slowly in her hands. "I think less of me. That's not the same as needing to do it." "No," Sarah agreed. "But it's the truth anyway." She looked out at the dark tree line beyond Ortiz's small yard, the same forest, technically, that climbed up in Ashford Hollow a few miles north, though it felt impossibly far from that clearing right now, sitting here with coffee and a porch light and a woman she trusted. "I keep thinking about Daniel's mother flying in from Phoenix, about having to look her in the eye eventually and tell her we did everything we could to make sure nobody else's kid ends up in that clearing. I can't tell her that if I sat this one out." Ortiz didn't argue further. She'd worked with Sarah for 2 years and recognized, in the set of her jaw, a decision that had already been made and reinforced past the point of further discussion. "Okay," Ortiz said simply. "Then let's make sure tomorrow night it's the one that doesn't walk away." They sat together on the porch a while longer, going over timing one more time. Hollis would position on the rock outcrop with the modified spotlights and a rifle of his own. Ortiz and Sarah would take the lower ground with clear sight lines to the clearing itself, and all three would maintain radio silence except for emergency callouts, on the theory, drawn from Hollis's decades-old notes, that the creature responded to sound and movement more than scent in its hunting pattern. By the time Sarah finally went inside to try for a few hours of sleep, the eastern sky had already begun its first pale, gray suggestion of dawn, and somewhere up the mountain, and ground had hunted for longer than any of them had been alive, something old and hungry slept through the daylight hours, gathering itself for the night still to come. They drove up in 2 vehicles just before sunset, parking a half-mile shore of the Birch Run trailhead and covering the remaining distance on foot in the fading light, weapons slung and movements deliberately unhurried. Hollis moved through the forest with the easy familiarity of a man who'd walked these particular trails for decades, pointing out landmarks without needing to consult his map. A lightning-split oak that marked the quarter-mile point, a deer trail crossing that he said the creature favored as a travel corridor based on years of second-hand tracking reports. The clearing, when they reached it, looked smaller in daylight than it had in Sarah's memory, an ordinary patch of open ground ringed by oak and hickory, grass still flattened in places from the search team's recovery effort 5 days earlier. She made herself look at the spot where she'd gone down without flinching, cataloging it the way she'd catalog any piece of terrain on a normal patrol, refusing to let the memory of weight and pain and those terrible aware eyes own the ground more than she did. Hollis took the rock outcrop on the clearing's northern edge, settling in with his rifle and the modified spotlight, testing its beam once against the darkening tree line before switching it off to conserve the battery. Ortiz and Sarah took positions along the western tree line, 20 feet apart, with clear sight lines to the clearing's center and to each other. "Radio check," Ortiz murmured, barely above a whisper, into her shoulder mic. "Copy." Hollis's voice came back, equally quiet. "Copy," Sarah confirmed. Then they waited, the way hunters had waited in these woods for longer than any of them, and the light bled slowly out of the sky, and the temperature dropped, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the first thin tendrils of fog began, almost imperceptibly, to rise. It came up the same way it had 5 nights earlier, against the light evening breeze rather than with it, pooling first in the low ground at the clearing's eastern edge before spreading outward with a deliberateness that no ordinary weather pattern should have possessed. Sarah felt her pulse climb as she watched it thicken, felt her hand tighten on her rifle, and forced herself through the breathing exercises Dr. Okafor had taught her in the hospital for managing the spikes of anxiety that had followed her out of that first encounter. She was not the same woman who had run blind through this fog 5 nights ago. She reminded herself of that fact deliberately, the way Hollis had told her to. She knew what was coming now, knew roughly what it could and couldn't do, had silver in her rifle, and 2 people she trusted on either side of her instead of facing alone in the dark. The fog reached her position within 10 minutes, cool and faintly sweet wrong against her skin, exactly as she remembered it. Through her earpiece, she heard Hollis's breathing go carefully controlled, the sound of a man bracing himself against an old fear he'd carried for 40 years. "It's close," he murmured. "I can feel it. Same as the other times." "Confirm visual before anyone fires," Ortiz said quietly. "We don't waste rounds on shadows." Sarah scanned the thickening white with her modified spotlight held ready but unlit, eyes straining against the fog's strange muffling quality, every sense pulled taut. Somewhere ahead of her, faint and getting less faint, she heard the low cadence of breathing that did not belong to anything human, and beneath it, almost too quiet to register, that same not-quite growl that had haunted her sleep for 5 nights running. It was here, and this time, she was ready for it in a way she hadn't been able to be before. "Eyes up," she whispered into her mic, "it's coming." The creature came out of the fog at the clearing's far edge with none of the patience stalking Sarah remembered from her first encounter. It came fast, low, and direct, as though it had already located all 3 of their positions and chosen its angle of attack before revealing itself at all. Hollis's spotlight snapped on first, catching the creature mid-stride in a wash of pale UV-tinted light that made it flinch and snarl, the sound full-throated and furious in a way that confirmed every worst suspicion Sarah had carried about what they were truly facing. It was larger than she'd let herself remember, its wrong-jointed limbs eating ground with terrible efficiency, even as it twisted away from the light toward the deeper shadow along the western tree line, directly toward Sarah's position. "Contact." Ortiz's voice, sharp and controlled, cut through the radio silence protocol the moment it no longer mattered. "West side, converging on Voss." Sarah didn't wait for further confirmation. She raised her rifle, found the creature's shifting mass in her sights through the fog-diffused spotlight glow, and fired 3 rounds in controlled succession, the silver-cord ammunition cracking against the night with a sound that felt, finally, like answering back instead of running. The first round caught it across the shoulder, and the creature staggered. Actually staggered this time, a visible break in its terrible fluid stride, a sound tearing out of it that was somewhere between a roar and something that might once have been a scream from a human throat. The second round went wide as it twisted. The third caught it low along the flank, and it went down hard onto the wet grass, snarling, thrashing but down. "It's hit," Sarah called. "Down but not out. Watch your angles." Hollis's rifle cracked from the outcrop, a 4th round finding its mark across the creature's back as it tried to rise. And Ortiz was moving now too, closing the angle from the south with her own weapon raised. And for one suspended moment it looked, genuinely, like they might end this here, in this clearing, on this night, the way Hollis's file had promised was possible if they did everything right. Then the creature found its feet again, faster than any of them expected even wounded, and turned toward Ortiz with a speed that gave none of them time to call a warning. Ortiz fired twice more as it closed the distance, and Sarah heard at least 1 round connect with a wet, heavy sound that should have dropped anything mortal. But the creature was already past the point where ordinary anatomy applied to it, and it hit Ortiz with enough force to throw her bodily into the rocks at the clearing's edge. Marisol. Sarah was already moving, cutting across the open ground with her rifle raised. Every careful tactical lesson Hollis had drilled into them over the past 2 days narrowing down to a single, simple imperative: get between the creature and the person it had just hurt. She fired twice more as she closed the distance, both rounds finding the creature's already wounded flank, and it wheeled toward her with a snarl that had gone ragged and furious, and, underneath the fury, something that sounded almost like pain in a register too complex for a simple animal to produce. It lunged. Sarah threw herself sideways into a roll that her body remembered from academy, training a decade old, came up on one knee, and put her last round into the creature's exposed throat at point-blank range as it twisted to follow her movement. The sound it made then was unlike anything she'd heard from it before, a high, broken keening that cut off abruptly as it collapsed, fully, finally, into the wet grass of the clearing, its terrible momentum exhausted, its breathing slowing into something labored and shallow, and unmistakably failing. Hollis reached them a few seconds later, rifle still trained on the downed creature, watching it with the wary attention of a man who had learned 40 years ago not to trust a kill until he confirmed it thoroughly. "Ortiz," Sarah called, dropping to her knees beside the older woman, who was conscious but pale, one arm held carefully against her ribs. "Marisol, talk to me. Crack something." Ortiz managed through gritted teeth. "Not the first time. I'll live." She looked past Sarah toward the still shape in the clearing's center, its labored breathing growing fainter by the second. "Did we get it?" Sarah looked at the creature too, at the way the fog around it seemed, gradually, to be thinning rather than thickening, as though whatever had been calling it into being was finally, after 40 years and longer, losing its grip. "I think we did," she said quietly. "I think we actually did." She was wrong about how simple that would turn out to be. But for one held moment in that clearing, with Daniel's death finally answered for, and Ortiz breathing rough but steady beside her, Sarah let herself believe, just briefly, that the worst of it was already over. The first hint that the fight wasn't fully finished came not from the clearing itself, but from what they found when the fog cleared enough, an hour later, for Hollis to examine the fallen creature under the steady beam of a normal flashlight. It was not a wolf. It had never quite resolved itself, even at the very end, into something Sarah's mind could file cleanly into a single category. But as the strange wrongness of its proportions settled in death, something else became visible underneath. The unmistakable structure of a human hand at the end of one foreleg, fingers curled and tipped with claws that hadn't fully replaced the nails beneath them. A face, beneath the elongated jaw, that carried the ghost of features a person might once have recognized. Hollis crouched beside it for a long time without speaking, his expression unreadable in the flashlight's wash. "You know who it is," Ortiz said. It wasn't a question. "I know who it might be," Hollis said quietly. "There was a ranger here, before my time even, name of Aldous Pike. Disappeared on a hunting trip back in 1974, presumed dead, never found. My old mentor used to say Pike's disappearance was the start of all this, that whatever happened to him out here is what started the cycle in the first place." He shook his head slowly. "I always thought that was just an old story rangers told to scare the new hires. Guess I should have taken my own file more seriously." Sarah looked down at what remained, feeling something complicated move through her. Not quite sympathy, not quite the satisfaction of a thread ended, but some uneasy mixture of both. "Does it matter who it was?" "Might," Hollis said. "If there's one of these things, there might be more than one origin story tangled up in how this all started. We should be careful about assuming this is finished just because this particular fight is." They radioed it in as an animal incident requiring specialized handling, a phrase Hollis had apparently used successfully with select state contacts decades ago. And within 2 hours a small, quiet team Hollis clearly had history with arrived to handle what the official record would never accurately describe. Sarah found herself unexpectedly grateful that someone, somewhere, had built infrastructure for exactly this kind of impossible night, even if she'd never wanted to need it. The weeks that followed had a strange, suspended quality to them. Daniel's memorial service drew most of the regional Forest Service staff and half the small town that bordered the park, and Sarah stood beside his mother at the reception afterward and told her, honestly, that her son had been brave in the moments that mattered, without elaborating on details that the woman didn't need and couldn't have processed. Ortiz's cracked ribs healed slowly, and she used the recovery time to quietly absorb the rest of Hollis's file into a properly organized record. Not for any official report, but because she decided, in the aftermath of nearly losing 2 of her Rangers in one season, that the next person who needed this information shouldn't have to rediscover it from scratch the way Hollis had been forced to decades ago. Sarah went back to work after 3 weeks. Her arm healed enough for full duty, though Dr. Okafor had noted with some surprise that the scarring along her shoulder had a slightly unusual texture he couldn't quite account for. Nothing concerning, he assured her, just an oddity of the healing process. She didn't mention to him that she'd noticed, in the weeks since the clearing, a faint sharpening to her senses that she hadn't had before. The way she could pick out the specific scent of approaching rain before the sky had visibly changed. The way her hearing seemed to catch the smallest movement and brush at distances that hadn't registered before. She didn't mention it to Ortiz either. Not yet. She told herself it was nothing, the lingering after-effect of trauma, sharpening her senses the way fear sometimes did. She mostly believed that. Mostly. What she didn't tell anyone, because she barely let herself examine it in her own head, was that some nights, walking the fire road on patrol with the moon riding high and clear, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel after everything that had happened. Not fear of the dark forest around her, but a strange, unsettling sense of being. It was Hollis who found the next thread in some small 3 months later, going back through old county records with the particular thoroughness of a man who'd finally been given real partners in his decades-long search for answers. He called Ortiz on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying an urgency she hadn't heard from him even during the worst of the Birch Run crisis. "There's a second one," he said, without preamble. "I should have seen this sooner." Pike wasn't the only ranger to vanish in these mountains under strange circumstances. "There's a woman, name of Constance Ahern, disappeared from a different district 40 miles south of here back in 1958. Different mountain range, similar pattern. Fog that came up against the wind, livestock losses in the weeks before, two hikers who came out of those woods describing something that doesn't match any known animal." "You think it's connected?" Ortiz said. "I think," Hollis said carefully, "that whatever happened to Aldous Pike out here might not be unique to this mountain. I think there might be more than one of these things scattered across the older, wilder corners of this country. And I think the fact that we finally stopped one doesn't mean the larger problem is solved." Sarah, listening on speakerphone from across Ortiz's kitchen table, felt the strange, sharpened awareness she'd been quietly carrying for 3 months prickle at the back of her neck. "What are you suggesting we do about it?" she asked. Hollis was quiet for a long moment. "I'm suggesting," he said finally, "that the three of us just prove something this file's never had before, a documented method that actually works. And I'm suggesting that if there's even a chance Constance Ahern's mountain has the same kind of cycle starting up Sarah again, drove home somebody who knows what they're doing, turning the conversation over across another family, the way she turned over difficult terrain before committing a patrol route to it. She thought about Daniel, 2 years into a job he'd loved, gone in a single foggy night. She thought about the look in Ortiz's eyes when she talked about wanting to build proper records so nobody had to start from scratch again. She thought, too, about the strange new sharpness in her own senses that she still hadn't fully explained to anyone, and the uncomfortable possibility, which she'd been carefully not examining, that the silver hadn't simply wounded the creature in that clearing, that something of the encounter, however brief, however ultimately survived, might have left more of a mark on her than 31 stitches and a scar. She didn't know, yet, exactly what that might mean for her future. She knew only that she had walked into that fog once already and come back out the other side, changed but intact, and that whatever the cost of that encounter eventually proved to be, she would rather understand it and face it directly than spend the rest of her career pretending it hadn't happened. She called Ortiz back the next morning. "I want to help Hollis look into Ahern's mountain," she said. "Properly. With backup, with a plan, with everything we learned the hard way at Birch Run. Not because I think I have to. Because I think I'm one of maybe 3 people alive who actually knows what we're looking for now. And that's not something I can just hand off to someone else and walk away from." Ortiz was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "You know, this might not be a one-time thing. If Hollis is right that there's a pattern across multiple regions, this could be the start of something a lot bigger than one bad season at Ashford Hollow." "I know," Sarah said. "I'm asking anyway." "Then I'm in," Ortiz said simply. "Somebody capable needs to be the one walking into that fog 6 months after the clearing. Might as well be people who already know how to walk edge of a different forest, in a different mountain range 40 miles south of everything she'd once considered familiar, watching the first thin tendrils of an unseasonable fog begin to rise against a windless evening sky. Beside her, Hollis Granger checked the action on a rifle loaded with silver cord rounds, and a few paces back, Ortiz coordinated quietly with 2 local rangers who'd reached out after hearing, through channels neither official nor entirely unofficial, that someone finally had real answers about the strange disappearances that had plagued Constance Ahern's old district on and off for nearly 70 years. Sarah felt the familiar prickle along her sharpened senses, the same uncanny awareness that had been growing quietly in her since the night in the clearing, and she let herself wonder, briefly, whether what she was sensing now was simply trained vigilance, or something a little stranger that the silver had left behind in her along with the scars. She didn't have an answer yet. She suspected she might not have one for a long time. What she did have was a working method, hard one and paid for in Daniel Reyes's life, in Ortiz's cracked ribs, and her own scarred shoulder. She had people beside her who understood exactly what they were walking toward, and had chosen to walk toward it anyway. And she had, underneath the fear that never quite fully left her these days, a steady and growing certainty that whatever waited in the fog ahead of them, she was no longer the kind of person who would simply run from it. The fog thickened around their boots, cool and faintly, unmistakably wrong. And somewhere deep in the darkening tree line ahead, something old and patient began, for the first time in decades, to take real notice of the hunters who had finally come looking for it. Sarah raised her rifle, settled her breathing, and stepped forward into the mist.